Hey Gators, here is the big part of Module 5, critical thinking. So again, this is getting into the textbook that you were asked to purchase and read for this class. It's by Richard Paul and Linda Elder, The Miniature Guide to Critical Thinking, Concepts and Tools, part of the Thinker's Guide Library, 8th edition. So we're going to be going into a lot of what they have to say, but you really do need to read that guide. It's very handy to kind of keep in your work desk as part of your toolkit for when you're going to be doing a lot of critical thinking, problem solving, and you can prompt yourself through that guide in order to do your best thinking at work when you're dealing with lots of different challenges and issues. Okay, so we're just going to give you an overview as to what all this is about and kind of go into the nuts and bolts of it, and then give you some of those templates that they provide in their book to go forward. So first, a definition of critical thinking. Critical thinking really is an intellectually disciplined process. I think people use it in a really ambiguous way, but it's an intellectually disciplined process, really thinking through the details of what's going on inside problem solving, analysis, and decision making, right? So it results in a guide to belief and action, a point of view, and a way of doing something. And you have to go through understanding, concepts and appreciation, decisions, synthesis, and application. Okay, so I should say, we believe we all think critically, but often we don't. We're kind of lumped into some other kinds of thinking, and we don't even notice we're doing it. So let's talk about those other kinds of thinking that are actually counterproductive to critical thinking. The first one is egocentric thinking. So egocentric thinking functions subconsciously, like a mind within us that we deny that we actually have. No one says, I think I will think egocentrically for a while. It's just something we kind of do on autopilot. The goal is gratification and self-validation, and it emerges from our innate human tendency to see the world from a narrow, self-serving perspective. It's focused very much on our own motivation, our own laziness, our own appetites, our own desires, right? So it gets after what we want, especially in that moment. So we naturally think of the world in terms of how it can serve us. And that's just kind of how we're built, how we're wired. Our instinct is to continually operate within the world, to manipulate situations and people in accordance with our own selfish interests. Now, manipulate is kind of a dirty word, but it's really, maybe a better word would be orchestrate, right? So we attempt to influence and have a say over what happens to us. So it might be for the better, it might be for the worst, but we're doing that actively, right, to get what we want. So at the same time, we naturally assume that our thinking is rational, and there's nothing wrong with it. No matter how irrational or destructive our thinking is, when we are operating from an egocentric perspective, we are seeing our thinking as reasonable. Our thinking seems to us to be right and true and good and justifiable, but our egocentric nature, therefore, creates perhaps the most formidable barrier to critical thinking. And we have lots of different studies that talk about this, that it's kind of the ego getting in our own way. So now, egocentric thinking can produce good things, okay? Essentially, I kind of want to bring a few highlights before I go through these emotions, okay? So we don't naturally consider the rights and needs of others, and we don't naturally appreciate other people's point of view or the limitations of the way we see things, okay? So we might say these kind of statements, and this comes from the Paul and Elder text. It's true because I want to believe it. It's true because I do believe it. It's true because we believe it. Maybe you share that with someone else. It's true because I've always believed it. It's your own self-validation. It's true because it's in my best interest to believe it, right? So, whatever justifies getting me more power, money, personal advantage, or satisfaction, even though it's not grounded in sound reasoning or evidence, and it doesn't require me to admit that I'm wrong, and I don't have to be questioned. I don't have to rethink anything. It's going to be that way because it works for me. So we often distort our own reality through these irrational lenses of how we see the world, right? So we use these self-centered psychological standards to determine what to believe and what to reject. Now, people are like, what's wrong with getting what you want? What's wrong with negotiating? We can get good things by that. Yeah, we certainly can. Let's talk about some of that. So the problems, or let's talk about first successful egocentricism. So even though it's irrational by nature, it can be actually very functional within a dysfunctional logic. So for example, it enables us to selfishly get what we want without having to worry about the rights of the people that we deny in getting what we want. So this type of thinking though it's defective from a point of view of evidence and sound reasoning and objectivity and playing fairly, it can be often deemed as successful through achieving the self-gratification we want. So that thinking is kind of inherently flawed, but it's successful in achieving what we're motivated to achieve. And we see this kind of thinking in many people of power and status in the world, like successful politicians. You see this in lawyers and business people and others. They're often skilled in getting what they want, and they're able to rationalize unethical behavior with a lot of sophistication. So, the rationalizations can be, it's a hard, cruel world out there. You have to be realistic. We don't live in a perfect world. I wish we did. And after all, we're just doing the way things have always been done, and that's how it is. And that means, conversely, rationalization can be as complex as that masked in a highly developed philosophy, ideology, or even a party platform. So though an egocentric thinker may use ethical terms in how they rationalize how they're thinking, they're not always responsive to ethical considerations, and they don't respect ethical principles. They only think of them when it seems to justify them getting what they want. So it's inherently different from adhering to guiding ethical principles or a genuine conscience of being aware of what other people want, taking account into the rights and needs of others. And so, a politician, for example, might take into account the views of a public interest group when their reelection depends on their support, right? They're not really focused on justice, but rather on their own personal gain. So corporate executives, might pay attention to their employees because they're worried about expected earnings of the company, and so forth. But they might not be as keen on flawed products, right? Their justification might be, let the buyer beware, even though that's really unethical behavior. Okay, so that's something to look out for. There are a lot of examples we can talk about when it comes to the problem of egocentric thinking, but these are the ways we know that we're emotionally experiencing it. Okay, so now we'll talk about this chart. Anger, irritability, defensiveness, arrogance, apathy, alienation, indifference, resentment, depression. Okay, so this is when we get caught up in all that egocentrism. Okay, let's change gears though for a moment to go into maybe the opposite, sociocentric thinking. Okay, so you probably studied this in some classes in sociology or research methods classes. We call it groupthink, right? So we often do not understand how internalized the dominant prejudices of our society and culture have become within us. And so this is kind of thinking too much about the other and not enough about ourselves. So sociologists identify this condition as a state of being culture bound. You can't see past your own group identity. So the problems that persist involve the uncritical tendency to place culture, nation, and or religion above all else, even our own good. Okay, so it's kind of funny how this works. The uncritical tendency to select self-serving positive images of ourselves and negative ones of those who oppose us, that's a problem. Okay, another problem that persists involves the uncritical tendency to place, again, culture, nation, religion above everybody. To assume group identities without a reason, to blindly conform to group restrictions, many of which are actually arbitrary or coercive. And you can see how this gets into things like conspiracy theories, right? A failure to think beyond the traditional prejudices of one's own culture or be able to internalize other cultures. It's a refusal to consider history or context that shapes what is before us, to realize that mass media can shape the point of view of that culture. The failure to distinguish universal ethics from relativistic cultural requirements and taboos, right? It limits the breadth and depth of your thinking because you're not thinking beyond your own cultural identity. So this can be a problem too. And these two ways of seeing the world and thinking are often what get us in the way of being critically thoughtful people. So pay close attention to these two because this is kind of where we're operating from. Okay, so a well-cultivated critical thinker raises vital questions and problems, formulating them clearly and precisely. They gather and assess relevant information using abstract ideas to interpret effectively. They come to well-reasoned conclusions and solutions. They test them against relevant criteria and standards. They think open-mindedly within alternative systems of thought, recognizing and assessing as needs be their assumptions, the implications, and the practical consequences. They also communicate effectively with others in figuring out solutions to complex problems. So usually your most successful work experiences involve these kinds of things, right? Because we've kind of covered all our bases. Things are well thought out. They're well formulated. They're well delivered. What boss would not want a person that thinks like this, right? This is the kind of thinking that is productive, efficient, and really gets after a benefit for everybody. So this is kind of a little chart to put some of these pieces together. This is called the Paul Elder critical thinking model. So we have to hold ourselves to intellectual standards, and then those intellectual standards must be applied to elements of reasoning in order to develop intellectual traits, which again leads to deeper intellectual standards. So it kind of goes around and around in a circle, but this is just a way to think through the standards, the elements of reasoning, and the intellectual traits that are further described in detail in the Miniature Guide to Critical Thinking book. So I admonish you to read that. Critical thinking actually transforms our perspective. So again, if you had an issue you were working on, so this might be your original critical thinking prompt. You might say, let's identify an ethical issue or a high-risk incident at work or in the classroom and analyze how you responded to it this month. Kind of see what went wrong or what happened. But if we were using the elements of thought and intellectual discipline and the things we talked about on this slide, the standards, the traits, the elements of reasoning, we might form the question this way. Briefly describe an ethical problem or high-risk incident you responded to in the past month. How did you conclude that it's a high-risk incident? What are your criteria? Provide at least 2 examples of evidence or pieces of information that informed your response or reaction. What were the possible solutions and what were the consequences? What did you decide to do? Based on your reflection, how could you have responded differently? Are there other points of view or perspectives that did or might have influenced your decision? So again, we're using this thought process to go deeply and broadly into the problem. So it takes practice to do this, and we're going to try to get some of that practice in this module so you can get more experience with it. Okay, so these are what we call our standards for thinking or elements of thought. We have clarity, understandable that the meaning can be grasped. Accuracy, free from errors or distortions, and we can assume that something's true. Precision, exact to the necessary level of detail. Depth, containing complexities and interrelationships. We haven't taken anything for granted. Breadth, involving multiple viewpoints, not using closed-mindedness. Relevance, relating to the matter at hand, making sure it's actually worthwhile. Logic, the parts make sense together. There are no contradictions. Significance, focusing on the important stuff, the non-trivial. And then fairness, making sure it's justifiable and not self-serving or egocentric, like we talked about. Okay, so we're going to go through each of these in a little more detail. There's one more we're going to add that's called sufficiency that we'll talk about shortly at that time. So first, let's talk about clarity. So when we talk about clarity, we're confused. This is the very basis of our thinking, right? When we are clear, we understand what we're saying, right? What we're hearing, what we're reading, we're very clear. If we don't start with clarity, then you really can't begin, okay? So that is the very first basis, using clarity, okay? So the questions you can ask yourself if you're trying to determine if you're being clear, or you could say these prompts. Could you say that in other words? Could you elaborate further? Could you give me an example or an illustration? Because there's nothing more frustrating than doing problem solving with a coworker or a team, and you realize that the team is actually going after 2 different problems, and there is not agreement on what the problem is because we weren't clear. And then you've just wasted everybody's time, and you don't want to do that. Accuracy. When we say what is true or correct, we're accurate. When we aren't sure whether something is true, we have to check to see if it is. So questions you can ask to ensure accuracy are, how could we find out if this is really true? How can we check this? How can we test this idea to see if it's true? How do you know what you're saying is true? Now, some people can take this as an attack, but so you need to come up with a way to say it that you can say, look, I'm not trying to attack your idea or our discussion. I just want to make sure that we're pursuing accurate truth here, to make sure we have evidence to support this direction, right? So you try to make it objective and not a pointed attack. Precision, we can speak with clarity and accuracy, yet lack precision or details to provide further definition, right? So if we don't have precision, then we're kind of up a creek. So there's some examples in your book to say someone's overweight. Well, we need to know how many pounds overweight they are to maybe do something more definitive about it, right? And that's accurate. They are overweight, and it's clear we're dealing with a weight problem. But what is the precision we need, the detail to actually go after it? So to ask a question to ensure precision, you could say, could you be more specific, provide more detail, or more exact? So we have the numbers or the facts to work with. So we're going forward with precision. Relevance. Something is relevant when it relates directly to the problem you're trying to solve, the question you're trying to answer, and whatever you're discussing, right? So you want to make sure you're relevant. You could say, how does what you say relate to the problem being addressed? How does the information relate to the question we're asking? Because you want to stay on track. It's really easy to get off task and off topic, and suddenly you're in a time-wasting situation, or you end up putting all this energy into something that doesn't really matter. So this is the why does it matter, and is this really connected to what we're doing? Depth. So depth's an approach that it refrains from being superficial or oversimplifying the issue at hand. So have we really thoroughly looked at this? What factors make this a difficult problem that we need to address? What makes this the problem complex? So it ensures you're not overlooking anything, okay? Or reducing something to something that it's not. Okay, so breadth is coverage, right? An argument that only considers one side of the issue. So getting breadth means you need to consider all the valid perspectives. Do we need to look at this from another point of view? Is there an alternative way of doing this, right? So to getting after breadth is really important too, not being exhaustive of all the possible ways out of this. Using logic. Thinking is logical when everything fits together. So being honest, saying this doesn't make sense to me. Can you show me how it all fits? Can I rewrite or rephrase this so the sentence's ideas all fit? How did you come to your conclusions? Can you explain how this follows the evidence? So it's, again, very logical to see. Significance is something is significant when it focuses on what is important and not what is trivial, right? So which of these facts are most important, or the most important problem to consider? Because you might find problems embedded within problems, kind of micro problems and macro problems. Is this the central idea to focus on? So this is important to get after as well. Fairness. We tend to privilege our own position, and therefore we need to treat all relevant viewpoints alike without personal bias, feeling, or interest. So you have to ask yourself, do I have a vested interest in the issue? Am I representing the viewpoints of others? And have we fully considered all the important information that's relevant to the issue to make sure that, that you're being fair? The last one I'm adding is sufficiency. Do you have the condition or standard to meet the needs of a situation or end? Is it sufficient? Are we missing any information to answer the question? Are we leaving out information that we'd rather not consider in order to ignore or downplay the rights or needs of others? So it's kind of a self-serving question, but sufficiency gets after that. We're going to come back with the second part of this lecture in another video. So hopefully you found this helpful, and we'll see you next time.